The sports department at the newspaper in Memphis, where I worked in the early 1980s, consisted of 8 or 9 desks tucked into the corner of the newsroom. It didn't get much respect from the other journalists. "How are things going in the toy department?" the business writer liked to say when he wandered past. He was involved in big things. Special reports on the city's economic prospects, profiles of corporate leaders, exclusives about national companies that might conceivably relocate to Memphis. My colleagues and I were focused on the quarterback controversy at Ole Miss and the vicissitudes of our minor league baseball team. "Must be nice," he'd chuckle. But if the stories that ran in our sports section day after day were ephemeral, their reach was wide. When I'd run into one of those business leaders at a party or on an airplane, all they wanted to talk about was sports. What did I hear about the team in the new football league that was coming to Memphis? Who would be the next basketball coach at Memphis State? And how about that quarterback controversy at Ole Miss? By the start of the 1990s, I'd left daily journalism for magazines. About that time, it occurred to me that the men, and infrequently the women, who owned and ran the clubs I wrote about often had more interesting stories than the athletes who played for them. In part, that was because the profile of the owners that sports leagues were attracting had started to change. When I was growing up, and for the decade or two after that, teams remained cheap enough that successful car dealers and local attorneys could afford them. Ownership was often a risky proposition. Many teams played before half-empty arenas and stadiums. Revenue from television and radio was insubstantial. Franchises relocated and even folded with regularity. It's not surprising that sports wasn't perceived as serious commerce. When a corporate magnate would buy a team, which would happen occasionally, he nearly always ran it as a hobby. I remember watching a New York Giants practice beside Preston Robert Tisch, who told me to call him Bob. The chief executive of Lowe's Hotels and Lorillard Tobacco, and a member of the Reagan administration, Tisch had bought half of the Giants from Tim Mara, the grandson of their founding owner, for $75 million. That seemed like a lot of money to me, but not to Bob Tisch. "I don't care if I never make a cent on the investment," he said, as we stood on the sidelines on a Tuesday afternoon. "I'm just going to pretend I never had that $75 million. A few years ago, I wrote a story about the investors who own small percentages of sports franchises but have little say in how they're operated. I called Randy Vataha, a former New England Patriots wide receiver. Vataha made his living matching wealthy individuals who wanted to buy franchises with the wealthy individuals who owned them and might be convinced to sell. I was curious to know why anyone would tie up $50 million to $60 million to own a 10th or even a 20th of a team as a silent partner. He reminded me of all the companies in the Boston area that were perceived as blue chip at the start of the 1990s when he started in the business, but had since disappeared. Wang Laboratories, remember that, he said? Gone. They're pretty much all gone. With hindsight, a wealthy investor in Boston who wanted his capital to appreciate should have figured out a way to put his money into one of 4 businesses. You know which 4 equities turned out to be a sure thing, he asked? The Red Sox, the Patriots, the Celtics, and the Bruins. No other companies in the city, he said, had gained nearly as much value over the preceding quarter century.